Hello, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Clearing the Cloud of Uncertainty, What You Need to Know When Considering an IT Sourcing Engagement. My name is David Goodtheme, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It's our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with AT&T. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin today's session, I'll quickly tell you about the questions box. Questions at any time during the presentation. To submit your question to today's speakers, just click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click the submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, the founder and CEO of the Outsourcing Institute, Frank Casale, to begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you, David, and welcome everyone to today's discussion. Look forward to a worthwhile and interactive session here. If you've attended our webinars before, you're quite familiar with the format. Our goal here is really to provide you with the latest best practices and exposure to some of the brightest minds in the industry, basically at the convenience of your desk, if you will, or wherever you may be. We also encourage interactivity, so if you have a question, David mentioned, feel free to submit it at any given point throughout the session. Quick overview of the Outsourcing Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we've been around since 1993. We have over 70,000 members globally. We track a variety of categories of outsourcing, ITO, BPO, KPO, if you will, large, medium, and small organizations. And if you're a practitioner, you probably come to us for best practices, trends, and networking opportunities. Service providers typically come to us to seek out network opportunities, as well as sponsorship programs that our team has in place. And we also have a wide array of programs for all members, including things like training programs, recruiting resources, et cetera. So that's just a quickie overview, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to contact us at the email listed below, and or just check us out at outsourcing.com. Thanks, David. Next slide. So I'm joined today by two experienced experts in the field, Tony Mataya, Managing Partner of ThinkSolutions, as well as Bob Keller, Director, AT&T Network Integration and Sourcing. And rather than introduce my colleagues, I will ask them to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Tony.
Thanks, Frank. Tony Mataya with ThinkSolutions. We're a sourcing advisory firm. My background is in sourcing for about 20 years, and I've worked on the buyer side, on the seller side, and as an advisor. So I have different perspectives. I've worked in IT outsourcing, business process outsourcing, and I focus quite a bit on people making decisions about offshoring, nearshoring, and alternatives to India. And that's my main role with the Outsourcing Institute, as well as in the technical areas. And I've got about $15 billion worth of contract value that I've worked on those kind of transactions. So hopefully I'll be able to give some different perspectives to the webinar today. Bob?
I'm sure you will, Tony. Bob?
Thank you very much, Frank and Tony. My name is Bob Keller. I'm the Director at AT&T Network Integration and Sourcing, and appreciate the opportunity to have this wide-ranging discussion today to talk about network sourcing, outsourcing capabilities. But my background, just a little bit to brief you on that, to give you a sense of where my knowledge comes from, is approximately 20 years in outsourcing, network sourcing. That started back from a technician's viewpoint. I also have done a number of stations, if you will, in voice and data architecture and engineering. I've also had the opportunity to manage outsourcing and negotiate outsourcing models. So from the contractual, legal, pricing perspective, AT&T's perspective as well. But also with that, it gives me the opportunity to look at the strategy as well and the development of strategy that goes along with outsourcing. And then eventually, once the outsourcing becomes rooted, the governance that goes along with that. We'll talk about that today, and that's something else that is very important, but we have very good insight into. Okay, I'll go ahead and I'll take it from there then, Frank and Tony, if you will, and we'll get right into the program today.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So again, this is Bob Keller, and again, appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to speak with everybody today. What I want to be able to ensure is I do not want to have this be specifically a one-way discussion. I'm looking for the opportunity to really create an interactive discussion environment with everybody that's on the phone today. So please, during the process, during the discussion, if there are questions about anything that I state on any of the slides, please stop me and ask the question. Obviously, I'll ask David and from a moderator, Frank and Tony's perspective, to chime in when we've got great questions from the audience. We're expecting a lot of that today. So please keep this interactive as we go. And that really takes us to the first slide. Sourcing and integration providers, I think there's really three that we really talk about on a day-to-day basis. And as a part of that, I think there are three types of those services: the solution provider, service integrator, and sourcing provider. Each have their own core focuses. As we progress into the conversation today, what we're going to do is we'll be discussing the relevance of the solution integrator, which is a resource that can provide the services of all three of the services that I just listed. So, what we're going to do is that provides and gives the operational continuum for the base support services that come across that. So we're going to really talk about how do you take all three of those and move those all into what AT&T provides from a sourcing provider, solution provider, if you will. Next slide. So one of the key things that we want to be able to do in talking about the solution integrator are what got us to the position to even begin to look at the reason for sourcing. And looking for a solution integrator to help us out. So, key trends in the market today, our virtual environment, global business, and mobile society. But inevitably, when we get to the point where CIOs are looking at the reasons for beginning to look at sourcing and integration, are really the key trends, right? Cost savings. The pressures associated with running our IT environment always pushes on the cost savings. Not very many people have an IT budget that grows on an annual basis. Generally, we're always asked to cut the next 3%. But with that, you were still expected to provide improved service levels. And then we're also expecting that as a part of that, when we begin to look at integration trends, it's the consolidation, standardization, and then integration with other partners and suppliers. I sort of skipped over innovation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the right side, but we'll also talk about that a little bit more because there are some polling questions that we're going to drive into this discussion today that we're going to specifically ask you about your thoughts on innovation. But as a part of that, then we talk about key business drivers, the rising operating costs. As I said, we're all expected that our IT budgets don't grow on a year-over-year basis. They generally get cut. And how we go ahead and work to be able to streamline the operations, because inevitably IT has to begin to look at itself, and from a CIO's perspective, you have to begin to look at how does IT bring the revenue to the business's bottom line. With that thought in mind, even though our budgets might get might be cut every year. So we begin to focus in on those other areas like inefficient processes and how that supports the potential for supporting to streamline the IT environment that we're currently in. But again, rapid growth, mergers, acquisitions, and competition force a different type of environment on us where we have to be able to scale solutions to accommodate that growth and drive the revenue to the business's bottom line. And then specifically on the mergers and acquisitions piece, we're always expecting to take IT, roll it out to those mergers and acquisitions, do it in an efficient process, but also that drives that capability of immediately recognizing the revenue to that new business that's just been added on to our environment. And as I stated, as a part of mergers and acquisitions, it really is about global expansion, but inevitably competition. How do we outpace our competition in the market for those businesses that go through all of these key trends? And I think that's really where the sourcing and integration piece begins to play a key role in keeping that competitive level, but exceeding in those competitive environments that you find yourselves in today. And again, like I said, I think we'll we'll hold innovation to the to when we get to a really question about what innovation does for your business.
Hey, Bob.
Any comments or questions?
Bob, one comment. You know, what I'm seeing in the sourcing marketplace is clients, just because of the things you mentioned, the trends in the market, but some of the trends on cost drivers and speed to market in order to compete. It's, you know, the days of the long 12 to 18 month sourcing engagements to pick a supplier, you know, be very, very driven on, you know, rates and cost per transaction and unit costs and things like that, have seemed to give way to clients who are trying to find, you know, more efficient, faster, better ways to kind of find who can be a partner to help them not only reduce costs, but all these other drivers. Are you seeing the same thing?
No, I mean, that's a great question, and the answer to that is yes. You know, and a perfect example of that, Tony, is thinking about, let's say, 2013. You know, we're in April and May timeframe, and a lot of the different clients that come to us are still looking for the potential for getting a deal done and gaining the benefits in 2013. So I think you're exactly right, is the pressure is always there, but the pressure to speed to gain those differences in cost as well as competitive advantage are all a part of it. So, you know, my comment to that and my experience has shown that depending upon the needs of the business, we are able to get through, whether it's a direct proactive discussion with a client or whether it's through RFP, but the ability to deliver in sometimes as short a time frames as 3 to 6 months, where a client can begin to view some of those immediate needs. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this as well.
Yeah, I know we're going to ask a poll question, but it seems like there's kind of a pressure to, while you're reducing costs, to you know, lower your ongoing operating cost and reduce headcount. At the same time, trying to do these kind of sourcing projects, and in addition to your day job, that's got to be one of the constraints that people face. At least that's typically what I see with our clients.
No, you're exactly right. And when we begin in a couple of the slides ahead after the polling questions, we begin to talk about sort of the areas where AT&T, from a sourcing perspective, can support and help in that environment, because you're right, it brings a lot of capabilities and resources to bear as you begin to try to forecast and do the discovery and the due diligence that has to go along with the transition areas of the environment. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few more slides, but that's exactly what we want to talk about and try to keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, next slide. So I think this takes us really into our first poll. And the poll question here is, does your organization have the resources required to achieve short and long-term objectives? So I think Tony just hit on it extremely well, which is the number of resources that we have to bear within our environments, you know, can be limited. But in the instances where we have to deliver strong results in support of revenue to the business's bottom line, you know, this really does suggest, do you have what you need in support of delivering those objectives to the business's bottom line? So I think as a part of that, then if the group here on the phone with us today can sort of take a couple seconds and think about that and bring their comments to that, we can utilize this as sort of a longer-term discussion point within the slides that are going to appear ahead. So any other comments, Frank or Tony, at this point?
Yeah.
Wait for the audience.
So this is Frank. Yeah, this is Frank. You know, Tony talked to speed, and we see that clearly within our membership. You know, limited resources is the thing that really puts it over the top as far as what doesn't make it work for most of these organizations. Right. So I was curious to see with regard to resources in this poll here, and apparently, I'm just taking a quick skim as right. You are here. You know, very few people. It looks like the majority are saying maybe 60%, and some saying 50% or less. I can tell you from recent discussions I've had and roundtables we've had with members, clearly the majority had inadequate resources. I would say the common response was either low or no from the standpoint of incremental resources for projects such as these. So I'm not surprised by these responses. How about you? How does this line up with your experience, Bob, in the marketplace?
No, I mean, Frank, this really does lend itself to a very, very credible poll, because inevitably in our discussions, part of the reason why we're brought in to talk to clients is exactly for that reason. You know, their ability to go ahead and maintain day-to-day, let alone trying to take on the opportunity to bring new technology to bear in the existing environment is just neglect, right? Neglected based upon a lot of the IT cutting that's gone on and continues to go on in the environment. So no, this really does line up exactly with what we're seeing in the environment today.
I think what we see is, and I think maybe is a great response, because so many of our clients are faced with reprioritization and trying to figure out, well, what do we have to do? And there's so much firefighting and tactical work that has to get done, and sometimes the strategic things which are necessary for the incremental and exponential change just can't get done because they're kind of on the back burner with the firefighting that happens. So you've got, the maybe response, I think, probably is a indicator of that.
Right. And actually, it really does, and Tony, the comment sort of leads us into the second poll question that we wanted to ask just for that reason, right? Because it really is about what is it that you're lacking? What is it that drives you to begin to look at the thought about sourcing? And so what resources do you feel your organization is lacking, the most in meeting short and long-term objectives? And inevitably, what we're going to talk about today is about the people, tools, processes, and systems, in different areas of the discussion. But, in order to be able to help us point and make more relevant topics to discuss, we wanted to go ahead and put this out there as well in order to get the people on the phone's view of that as well. So if you can go ahead and hit on that, and we'll get a response from that, and we can use that as part of our discussion points throughout the rest of the slide as well. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that.
So this is, yeah. Go ahead, Tony.
No, I was going to say the people and processes, I think, being oftentimes the main driver in these type of projects doesn't surprise me to see that's the real hot issue. I think a lot of times there have been implementations of system and tools, but in some cases they're more immature in the market. But having people and processes in place where you can bring those to bear on these type of projects is normally what we see also as limiting factors.
Right. No, I think that's a perfect.
Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Frank. I was just going to say, if you think about, the biggest change for most of these organizations in the past 4, 5, 6 years, it is people, right? So very few of them have the same staff that they did in 2006 or 7, and that's where they're hurting. So no surprise to me that that's really the most responded to area here, and it's also the one that, from my discussions with these organizations, that's the toughest problem for them to solve, because most of them are not getting additional headcount. That's big, so that makes the challenge even worse. In the old days, they would say, we're short a couple people, let's hire them.
Right. Actually, I think this is probably a great response, too, because inevitably, in a lot of the discussions, as we've discussed, right, these are really the things that we're seeing out in the field that really does drive the discussion points with our clients as we go out and have them. And as a matter of fact, it sort of leads us into the next slide, which is even, really begins to talk to, the do-it-yourself versus hiring a skilled solution integrator, really, and everybody probably recognizes this from just the idea of the ITIL model, and that's really where we begin to have the discussion about, based on that last poll from the people and processes perspective, is exactly that, is those two individual elements, right, from a people and processes is what this is really all about. And one of the things that we like to try to bring to bear here as a part of, looking at this, starting at the 12 o'clock position with the incidents and working our way around the clock here, and each one of these industry best practice models is, if you do have the lack of resources, who really in your environment really begins to care for the ideas of each one of these areas that as we go around the clock. Obviously, the intent for most of our resources that we have within our teams from an IT perspective is operational. It's keeping the lights on. And inevitably, that's where we find that the discussion really does begin to start is, I want to keep the lights on. I want to do that better. How do I make that better? Because that really is key to my immediate success and staying employed with my current boss is in order to be able to do that. So the incident, problem management, event management really does become, sort of key to that. As we begin to move our way to the right, you begin to look at the key aspects of what is it that I'm doing well, but how do I begin to bring to bear, really begin looking at beyond the operating aspect, but how do I optimize my environment, right? And you're going to hear the key terms associated with that a little bit more later on, but how do you begin to bring the key capabilities as far as stewardship and performance reporting into the environment that allows you to begin to look at sort of one of the cost drivers, right? Which is, how do you lower your cost if you don't potentially understand the environment that drives the performance and the capacity management for connectivity across the foundational architecture that makes up your IT infrastructure. And I think that's one of the key things I want to note here too is, as we talk a little bit around the clock, is the solid foundation of the network really does care for your ability to begin to layer on top of some of the other key aspects of the technologies that have to be brought to bear to begin to provide some of those other key capacities, capabilities from the technology and strategy and vision. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And obviously, as we begin working around, we look at the 6 o'clock position, the ability to be able to look at the asset inventories and the configurations associated with the environment. Talk a little bit more about the forecasting or inventory side of it a little bit later, but you have to begin to understand what's in that environment that makes up the foundation of your infrastructure in order to ensure the key capabilities allow for the technology upgrades, or you have the ability to identify those key areas that need to be upgraded first that allow you to get to that next layer of technology capabilities to reduce those costs. And I think that continues, we continue to the left, which we talk about the operational aspects, but inevitably, because we have to keep the lights on, we have to reduce risk in our environment. The change management, project management, service request management are keys to that. How do you reduce the risk associated with those changes that may come to the environment beyond the initial operation needs, but to begin to layer on those technologies. And then finally, and we'll talk more about this as well, and I think this ends up being the key capability that is brought to the table and supported by the skilled solution integrator, is the governance of the model once it's put in place, but understanding how from an executive management and operational environment, how do you bring that governance to be able to relate back to every area of your business and IT infrastructure within that environment, and how that will bring you the benefits associated with the potential agreement that's put in place by that skilled solution integrator. So, any comments or questions on this slide?
So one comment, Bob. What I've seen a lot out there is clients who struggle to implement a real robust, kind of across-the-board implementation of these different areas. So they might be strong in one area, but maybe they haven't implemented a lot of proactive, maybe a CMDB, or they don't have a good change management process in place, or a good PMO office, or So the struggle, I think, is that while a lot of times we would view those as basic foundational needs to run IT, I think a lot of clients, first of all, have trouble implementing it, really deeply across the board, and then secondly, it's tough to keep up with investing in improving those over time.
Right.
from a service provider perspective, is this something that you guys bring to the table when you come into an environment?
Right. That's a great question, Tony, because, and the answer to that is yes. I think that's clearly one of the benefits, from our side of the world is that we do have the systems, tools, and processes associated with each one of these areas of concern, areas of expertise. And again, as an example, right, when we generally go out to discuss with a client who's looking at trying to improve the business, right, reduce the risk, and trying to move forward in solidifying their foundational architecture, we begin to do a lot of discovery and work on documentation associated with that environment. And you're exactly correct. What we begin to see is a larger part of the inefficiencies and productivity are based on the lack of those existing best practices and the documentation associated with best practices across these key areas. So it is one of the things that we bring to bear is that set of foundational capabilities that allows a customer to go, okay, they've got it. They know exactly what I need based on that experience and how it's going to relate to my areas of concern associated with that.
Okay, thanks.
You're more than welcome. All right, next slide. So I think this is really where, and maybe leading back sort of as a segue from Tony's question and the commentary thus far is really what is the network sourcing fundamental vision or strategy or tenet that we see out in the field today, and really what is it that our customers are looking for? And I think Tony really hit on it is, the areas of a customer's environment, thinking about those best practice areas, but now thinking more about the foundational architecture is the complexity and how distracting there are in the lost productivity and increased expenses that go along with, let's say, the different areas of expertise that a client environment has to have today to be operational and moving forward and trying to drive towards that technology, the technology nirvana that we continually try to get to drive costs out. So on the left-hand side, what we're trying to begin to, or what we're seeing in the environment, but what we try to drive to is delivering, a simplified high-quality network. So if you look on the left side of the chart here, you begin to see how architecture and modified services and keeping the light screen and service levels and financial management all have potential areas where several different groups run several different areas. And I think that's where we begin to see how the teams quickly begin to be distracted. And we see this a lot out in the field today where some of the engineers down in the firewall side don't work with the server engineers, or the people responsible from the circuit side don't work with the people in the VoIP IPT side. Similarly, the TDM PBX environment doesn't work with anybody in those fouling circles. So what we're trying to be able to do is bring the idea that as you begin to look at that, and I think everybody would agree on here, when you have, let's say, 5 distinct and separate entities, the ability to be able to correlate and bring simplification in the environment, even on an incident, begins to bring a level of complexity and risk, if you will, to the environment. So I think what we're trying to communicate here is this is one of the reasons why sourcing and integration begins to play a key role in, let's say, collapsing the ability to understand the environment and the ability to simplify it and contain it. And how do you do that, right? And that's really the key, is how do you do that? It's the understanding of the environment, it's the documentation and the discovery of that environment that allows us to begin to collapse it into a nice circle that gives us key areas of focus associated with, as we've talked about, the architect, the modified and the services, the change management aspect, the incident event problem management, and the SLAs and the financial management. As you simplify, you begin to drive the productivity and drive out the costs. So really, to simplify this, squares, as you begin to understand your environment, you begin to drive all those key capabilities into your environment.
Bob, we have a question from the audience. They're asking, and it seems like it's relevant to this slide. They're asking about how many service providers, start using big data analytics, FTE ratios, kind of diagnostic logs, and all the data associated with this to make, to make improvements, make decisions. And so that they can improve their services to the customer with minimal cost wastage. It seems like that's a great question, and it would be a lot easier to implement something like that on the right, where you're managing the environment, versus the left, where it may be difficult to get that big data kind of analytical view. It's so complex that different formats of data, different, you'd have to do extracts across this. So are you seeing a trend also where you guys are able to leverage that information on the right side once you get to that point where it's a more, coherent, managed, and simplified environment? You can then leverage that information for those things that they're asking about?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic from a question perspective, because really that's the beginnings of understanding of where the benefits come from. So from a big data analytics perspective, I mean, it's sort of one of the key terms that we hear a lot today. But in this instance, from a big data perspective, each of these areas, and we're only showing 5 here, right, from the firewall server circuits, PBXs, and VoIP services. But thinking about correlation, that really does play sort of is the key word that goes along with the big data analytics. And we'll talk a little bit more about the correlation through how AT&T does it as a part of our sourcing strategy. But the best way to answer that is yes, AT&T in this instance begins to bring together all of those sources of data and piles them all into a big engine, a correlation engine that allows for us to do a couple different things. So think about that on the incident side, where we take the data from the correlation engine associated with the monitoring and management of the environment. And as an example, right, so if there's an incident in the environment, let's say even as simple as a router interface, that the cause of that router interface going down, there may be 14 or 15 separate incidents tickets that would get generated in the environment as it may exist today in the we'll call it the non-efficient and overly complicated environment, where several different incident tickets get generated in ITSM, Remedy, or whatever you have in the environment today. And then one of the technicians, engineers, has to then begin to look at all 14 tickets and make the decision on where they need to affect their decision making on what to attack first. So I think that's where you begin to see that is exactly that. It is the correlation of that's done without the individual having to make the decisions, but the correlation engine itself making the decisions. So, yeah, Tony, I think that's one of the keys to think about is when you correlate that data and oversimplify it down to where a single incident ticket is generated, it allows you to move forward and drive the efficiencies and productivity into your environment. And as such, maybe just as the second example to that is, the fact is that you have customer sat issues that are driving the need to be able to simplify quickly and get to a solution quickly in order to get the business back online. But that then goes back to what are your service levels and how do your service levels relate back to your key business clients internally. And when you have the ability to go ahead and begin shore up the correlation down to a simplified manner, that means your requirements back to the business, back to your clients on the service levels, begin to show a positive trend based on that ability to do that.
I know in the contractual view, a lot of clients always want to make sure and emphasize, proactive and predictive and preventative. It seems like having that ability enables you to prevent incidents, as well, and that way, you're actually improving customer sat by avoiding those problems and identifying trends and things before they become a problem. Whereas on the left, it's often difficult. You're more reactive in solving problems, and maybe you can do it, you've been able to live with that. But as the service levels and demands require it, it seems like on the right, it gives you that ability to be a lot more proactive in the way you do things. And I think that's one of the things I found clients have difficulty getting to that next level.
Right. And again, it's about time, right? I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about from the best practices initially on the other slide is utilizing performance, right, as a means to be able to identify utilization issues across all of these environments to help us begin to proactively identify key areas of concern. So you're exactly right. It's a simplified sort of view of that, but that's exactly what it does. And the fact is that if you have one individual in a sort of a resource-bare environment, their ability to go back and look through the performance and utilization of the infrastructure and begin acting on it really does become an issue, and one of the key things that drives towards the sourcing environment.
Bob, Frank here. Two quick additional brushstrokes on that. One is, from my experience, one cannot overemphasize the power of simplifying. There seems to be so much struggle out there with complexity in every shape or form. So I just wanted to just kind of put a highlighter on that word simplify. Really powerful, truly beneficial to these organizations for so many reasons. The other thing, just to play off of what Tony mentioned before about really leveraging the big data play here, is where I've seen this really deliver in spades is not only where one would have, a big and experienced organization like AT&T in there to actually kind of gather the big data, right, to get those data points on the intelligence on the back end. But I have found that when you're working with a third party, that the likelihood of actually seeing and utilizing that information and benefiting from it is much, much greater. I can't tell you how many times I've seen internally where there was some data available and then just nobody even looked at it because everybody's just on the treadmill. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And actually, I think that sort of leads us into the next slide where we start really beginning to understand key areas. You may have heard me use the terms operate and optimize, but it begins to help us understand is how do we help, right? How do we help to get to that term simplify? So, in the skilled solution integrator model, when you begin to think about that, right, service management or management of the infrastructure takes on sort of 4 key things, scale, scope, skill, and integration. And each one of those has its own specific definition associated with that, but really to clear the slide, it's really about the beginnings of understanding the client's environment that allows you to begin to take those separate fiefdoms and begin to take that data, understand it, and then begin relating an operational process, with the technical expertise, the end-to-end management that goes along with that, and molding it into that simplified foundational model that then can be viewed by the correlation engines within our environment. And for AT&T's perspective, and we'll talk about this on a separate slide, but that system is called iGEMS, and that is really our correlation engine that was developed by AT&T's labs in order to be able to provide that capability based on all those big data analytics that go along with that. But as a part of that, I think it's important to note on this slide, we talked a little about third-party services, but all the key areas of management that really require the type of expertise that allows us to begin to operate the client's environment. So this really assumes that a client has come to AT&T and has said, okay, we'll put our infrastructure and foundational capabilities in your hands. What are you going to do with it, and how are you going to do it? And I think one of the things as we look at the bottom and we begin moving from left to right is, first thing we have to be able to do is to operate the environment, right? So the intent is be able to do all the things that you're doing today, stabilize the environment, and operate and monitor and manage that environment in a stable, with the migration of risk to AT&T to be able to do that. So one of the key things, as we talked about earlier then, is you begin to move from the operational model to the optimized model. That's when you really begin to look at the overall performance and capacity management of the environment to ensure that based upon this, you begin to see the streamlined processes. You begin to see, from a multi-vendor environment, do you really need as many vendors to provide the services that you had in place today? So as an example, I've been in contact with a number of individual clients that you walk in and you begin to see even from a U.S. domestic or multinational, 300 vendors to provide services in different areas of the world, but where potentially those 300 vendors really could be knocked down to maybe 20, right? Those are the kind of things you begin to see where you can provide some relevant capabilities to start scaling that multi-vendor environment to begin that cost reduction model that we talked about. One of the other key areas too we talk about from a skills perspective, understandably resources as they change or as they're managed in the client environment is, how do you continue as you move into the optimized stage and begin to move into technology transformation stage? It's the education of the team that's going to support your environment. So that's really where you begin to now think about from the optimization to transform. It's the vision and strategy that goes along with the CIOs, and how do you do that, and how do you keep a consistent capability within your team to manage the environment while you keep the education up. So I think that's one of the things we'll talk a little bit more as you move into that vision and strategy of transformation to new technology, and how we're able to do that through the solution integrator model. And then inevitably, it's really the end-to-end management associated with that, and how you deliver against integrating key areas, within the environment that you're managing, but it's inclusive of those third parties that make up key areas of your infrastructure as well. Again, as I talked about, we've touched on the thought of what innovation is and how and what that might mean, but we'll talk a little bit more about that from a polling question. But maybe I'll open this back up now to any comments or questions, Tony or Frank, or anybody in the audience.
We have a question from the audience about, if you look at the bottom of the chart, they're asking, does Innovate loop around back to operate for continual service improvement?
That's a great question, and the answer to that is yes. Most of the CIOs probably on the phone here understand that most of us have to create a 1, 3, and 5-year plan, and I think one of the things that I've seen in the environment is Innovate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but Innovate allows for us to be able to help create that vision strategy in order to be able to support that. And it does circle back right to the operate, because inevitably the teams that are in place have to be roped in and related to that strategy and that vision in order to be able to simply drive it back into an operational model. So the long answer is I gave it, but the short answer is yes. It does play a key role on a going forward basis. And that's one of the keys that AT&T does bring to the table from a sourcing perspective. It allows for, as an example, for the number of clients that we do work with, each one of those clients from a sourcing perspective has what we call a chief architect. And I think this is sort of key to the thought is that those chief architects, and I would suggest that there's anywhere between 500 to 1,000 of them, all deal with the same type of questions on a day-to-day basis, but it's the collective, sort of the collective of the hive, if you will, of the knowledge and understanding of the strategy and development of that strategy and how it impacts each one of those clients, but how it's utilized within that chief architect hive and how it's utilized across all those customers. So it's one thing to note here is that because there's an innovation that may have taken place in one client, it's not put away. It can be utilized by a number of other clients as it benefits the collective. So good question. Next slide then. So I think that really does take us to what I sort of alluded to throughout the discussion as far as really what does innovation mean. And the number of clients that I've spoken to, it means a lot of different things. So we thought we'd give everybody the opportunity here today to go ahead and provide what you thought innovation means to you, and then we can utilize that as based on your responses to sort of move this forward and maybe focus in on those key areas based upon the response. So, Tony or Frank, any comments?
I think innovation is one of those areas where clients are constantly asking for innovation. Suppliers tout it from a marketing perspective, but oftentimes it's a question of expectation, and really what are the expectations of the client, and what is actually included in the deal, and what are the incentives to innovate. So I'm interested to see this question about, from a CIO perspective, what does innovation mean?
Yeah, this is Frank. Everybody wants it. It's tough to get everybody to agree what it is. So this is really the right question, right? At the end of the day, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So what does innovation mean, to the practitioner? So I'm curious to see the responses.
So it's interesting, the real emphasis on path to business growth, and that would be similar to a lot of what we see is in the, innovation seeing as a way to really impact the business. And I think one of the struggles we see is that the business units are really demanding innovation, and they're implementing innovation, and they demand the IT and the business process support to be there in lockstep with implementing those new products and services to the marketplace, and that's often a struggle.
Yeah, well, what I really like about this, the headline here as I see it, is that, the discussion between the CIO and the CFO can shift from this, perpetual, ongoing, torture about how much money to save each year to the CIO sitting at the table and being a potential source of incremental growth or incremental revenue. So it really changes the game if they can get their arms around that, and if they can start to be able to make a business case for that. And in parallel, does the same for the provider, for you folks, right? Getting in there saying, hey, listen, it's not just about the cost. It's not just about bottom line. It's about top line here. And my sense is, Bob, is you're able to have conversations about both top line and bottom line for your clients that really utilize your services in a comprehensive way.
No, that's exactly right, Frank. Inevitably when we do get into an environment and have the discussion with the CIO and the CFO, the successes generally revolve around the ability to, and we talked about governance a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the ability to have the discussion at the path to business growth. And that's, those are the customers where we do believe that they have the sense that the benefit and the value that can be brought to the table based on that vision and the strategies that develop around to build the new business growth is exactly what they're looking for and what we can deliver. And actually, that's a great segue into the next slide, because the whole idea, the whole idea behind what the solution integrator does bring to the table is the value, right? The fact is that when we do sit at the table with the CIO and the CFO, really do drive the key aspects of these four key areas, right? The economy, the simplicity, the transformation, and the evolution, and where those begin to allow for the realignment of resources and the capabilities that are brought to a foundational architecture, a foundation of services that allows for the customer, at the CIO level, begin to focus on areas and issues for solutions, and then begin to integrate those other key areas of ideas and resources. You heard me talk about the chief architects and the number of them and how they interrelate amongst many multinationals that allow for that capability. And then, the idea of moving forward with confidence because of the track record associated and just the knowledge base that goes along with that many, hundreds and thousands of clients that utilize, the same strategic vision that delivers that overall capability that we call evolution or innovate. So, again, the idea here is at the end of the day, the key aspects of is always improvement of the business, the process and performance, the ability to be able to ensure that the lights are always on, and the ability to not bring an approach for my vision and strategy from a 1, 3, and 5-year perspective that says they're bringing specific processes to the table and extensive experience that allows them to provide recommendations to my environment from a technology perspective that allows me to get to exactly what that poll question says. It allows me to move my business and bring business benefits and drive revenue to the bottom line through those capabilities. So it is all about solutions, capabilities platform, and the operational platform. Any comments or questions on this slide? Okay, next slide, please. So I think that really gets back then to the basis of somebody has made a decision that allows for a sourcing, outsourcing, let's say with AT&T in this instance, and then what does AT&T do? And I think we went back and we talked about, really the partnership has begun. And I think Tony hit on it a little bit earlier is there's a lot of detail and information and alignment between the two businesses that need to occur in order to ensure success. We talk about governance and what that brings to bear, but as a part of that, some of the key aspects of not having enough resources in your environment to be able to take the amount of time to be able to do your day job, and then plus begin to help support the transition of your environment. And really this slide really begins to communicate sort of assessing the inventories and the resources. And as was stated, when you begin looking at skills, it really talks about your current resources, your people in the environment today, understanding what it is that they do, what they bring, the background associated with their capabilities associated with that, right? We begin to document and understand fully how their skills do provide and continue to provide a key role in the success of what we would consider to begin to call transition. So infrastructure similarly, we talked a little bit earlier, and Tony also talked about CMDB, but the idea here is what type of documentation do we have to have of the existing infrastructure in order to ensure that you do allow for the management of risk and understanding how that infrastructure and the documentation of that infrastructure may pose a risk to the beginning of the transition. And that's where connectivity comes in, because as you look at it, the environment that allows you to begin to move into the model of transitioning to a sourcing agreement also allows you to do a couple other key things. It allows you to look at your existing engineered, architected environment, both from a connectivity perspective at the transport layer, but begin to look at it, does that make sense as you transition? Does your transition need to really be a like-for-like scenario, or does this offer you the opportunity to begin to understand the benefits of the agreement that you're putting in place? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well, and how the benefits of the agreement really lead into some other capabilities in the connectivity side. And then, the available data and access to that information. So that's one of the other key aspects of the discovery and work with the existing resources, is to ensure that, we do have appropriate access, because inevitably transitions often get slowed down based upon the inability to be able to collect the data that needs to be collected in order for both teams, to partner to begin to understand the information that needs to be gathered to do that. So again, as it states, this is essential for support for successful outsourcing.
Hey,
so
Bob,
any comments or questions about about that, please?
Yeah, Bob. I mean, it's pretty rare that we find a client that has perfect documentation and all the information about their environment and network diagrams and everything perfect. Does that mean that they should wait and get all that done, or are there some things, we've already talked about resource constraints, but are there some ways you can work together with them to help move forward in an agreement where you kind of can leverage some of your tools or people or resources to help to move forward, even if they don't have perfect data and documentation?
No, I mean that's a great question, and the answer is yes. And I think that's one of the one of the capabilities that you look at is somebody understands, the CIO understands that there are gaps in detail and information. And one of the things that we do bring in is a level of discovery and tools that allow us to be able to go out and take a look at the network as it exists today and really use a scripted methodology, automated methodology that goes out and gathers the detail about your existing infrastructure. So if you can ping it, we can gather the detail or the information about it. And it helps us to really begin to create that picture and fill gaps. So generally what we begin to do as a part of that, right, in the discovery phase, if you will, is with the agreement to be able to have access to your infrastructure and allow our tools to take a look, we help you begin to do that as well. So no, that's a great question. And we bring the resources to bear to help you do that. So, if you're willing to allow us to come in and take a look, we're also willing to do that to help build the more complete picture to be able to do that.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome. Great question. All right, next slide. So I think that really relates back to the comment, right? I talked about the word partner, and I think that's really where that word begins to play a key role in the sourcing integrator environment and the client environment. A lot of people use the term supplier or vendor. I think this is the area where we begin to understand from a governance perspective, but really as a true partnership in the sourcing agreement, what that really means. And I think this slide really begins to show how AT&T, plays a role across all facets of this diagram. Now, we've got it labeled as executive, management, and operational from a color-coded perspective, but understanding that AT&T's responsibility from a sourcing perspective plays into these key areas of capabilities, but what we're really trying to communicate here is that from a CIO perspective, the vision, the strategy, and architecture is something that's retained and driven based upon the needs of the business, but also based upon the capabilities that have been thought of before. Now, the ability to exercise and to make that come to fruition really is where AT&T comes in to be able to begin helping the CIO to do that and craft that. This slide really does begin to, it shows all the key areas that can be affected by the governance, from an executive management operational part, but it also, lets everybody know that where we play a role and how we provide input and our experiences associated with these, and there are obviously more within the business, but we touched on these key areas just to give the sense of what we touch, how we touch, and how the partnership is created in every layer.
So does that say that if I'm responsible for strategy, that you guys would bring, proactively bring, what new technology trends are and how they could implement the business, and the fact that you know the business, that would enable you to support the CIO or the executives, even though they're responsible for that, but they're going to rely on your knowledge of the environment and your knowledge of the industry to do that?
Right. No, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, because I think one of the things that you find out, and if you could go back to the other slide for a moment, please. I think one of the things that we're trying to impress is really when you see the AT&T person as a part of your team. The AT&T badged individual has also the client badge on. And I think your comment and your question is right on. Is our job in support of that vision and strategy is to bring key aspects of innovation and technology enhancements that are over and above what the CIO may have seen today, based upon, as I suggested earlier, the chief architects and their ability to access hundreds of other innovative ideas to that environment that that may or may not have been thought of. So that is the value that we bring to the table, is access, and then we bring it to the table with the CIO, and we bring the idea of how we can blend that in and bring it to fruition in that environment. So no, that's a great question. But we are a part of the team. We do wear the client's badge, and we think like the client does in how we deliver benefits to the business. All right, now you can go to the next slide there, David. All right, so I think one of the key things, right, and obviously we talked about cost, and we've talked about transition a little bit, and transformation and innovation. Inevitably, we're driven back to measurement, from an outsourcing success, and what that really means. And as a part of when we talked about the gathering of the inventory, one of the other things is your ability to deliver against a base case. So your existing cost today versus what you want your cost to look like tomorrow. And inevitably, what these two pictorials are trying to show is that there's two methods that can be brought from a financial perspective. You have to look at these slides as the communication that we're trying to bring here is you have two ways to be able to get to a 5-year number from a cost reduction aspect, and that's either early investment from a transformational perspective, and that's the slide on the left, is looking at your cost today and what you need to do in order to be able to gather the cost benefits by year 5. So a more trended transformational upfront, can bring the larger benefits over the 5-year term, depending upon the needs, whether it's OPEX or CAPEX needs to be able to do that investment. Similarly, I think the business case to the right shows a more structured and conservative investment strategy into transformation that allows you to still bring the cost benefits and savings to the business, as we've communicated, although it may not be as large as what's pictorially shown on the left, but it still brings the level of benefit. So that can be done in a lot of different ways from a financial perspective, and that's one of the key things that's, in a 5-year deal, it's necessary to communicate. We can work with the client to be able to create a financial model that allows us to drive the level of success and the cost savings that goes along with that. So any comments or questions about this slide?
Yeah, this is Frank. When it comes to measurement, that's another scenario, Bob, where I've seen it done just a lot better by someone else.
Right.
And I think it just has to do, again, with limited bandwidth, limited resources, and just, the strain on all that's going on internally. So everybody wants things measured. And I think it relates also back to the big data thing before. By working with an experienced third party, you're much more likely to get, well, you will get, you're ensured that you will get that measurement that you're looking for, which is not as likely to happen internally, from my experience.
No, that's exactly right, Frank, and I think that is the benefit. It's sort of the forest through the trees, but it also brings new levels of thought when we look to build the agreements to fit the client need from a savings perspective over the term of the agreement.
So, Bob, question from the audience is, so if it's required to get savings early in the deal, like in the first year, but there's an upfront transition cost, so is it possible, then does it show here where you're able to maybe minimize the upfront cost and then roll that out into the deal and kind of financially engineer that to meet some client financial objectives?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and the answer to that is yes. So, a larger part of the benefits, right, depending upon how you want to build the deal, allows for that type of thinking. So you can take maybe some of the larger transition one-time charges that go along with that initial 6-month transition, if you will, and that can be amortized over the life of the deal. So, in regards to potentially, depending upon whether you do a CAPEX or OPEX type of purchase or other, those types of investments can be amortized as well. I think it's a good point too. And the larger part of the deals that we negotiate, and it's true, is generally there are credits that are associated with larger deals that allows for some of that additional investment associated with year 1 and year 2 as well. That's another way to look at it. And then I think maybe the last part of that is that when you begin to look at growth in the environment, and we talked about mergers and acquisitions a little bit earlier, one of the first slides, but thinking about growth and mergers and acquisitions, as a means to be able to create a financial model that begins to allow for trended growth through the mergers and acquisitions that bring larger tiered benefits from a cost reduction, on a per unit price, right? When you make those additional purchases of other businesses along the line. So we do try to think out in front that allows for that thought process to manage unit pricing based on growth of the environment as well. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yep.
All right. And I think this slide here that we're trying to present here is, and you've heard me talk about governance earlier on, and I think this slide really begins to talk about sort of the concepts of skills, resources, experience, and tools, but it also begins to wrap in the idea of what sourcing, and from a components perspective, makes this successful. And the integration, management, client servicing, and contracts. And I think one of the things that those are all elements of a governance model and a sourcing model. One of the things I think that, as you look at the slide, and everybody would probably suggest is missing, is the ability to integrate customer satisfaction at the end of the day, and how that really drives, a successful sourcing engagement. Because at the end of the day, the partnership, the relationship, being driven by these key aspects of it, right? Skills, resources, tools, and experience, ends up, bringing the type of success based on the customer satisfaction, based on the partnership, and how we govern a successful sourcing engagement. So as we look in each one of these areas, they're specifically, they're tactical, they're functional, but at the end of the day, it comes down to customer sat, and that we're hitting the targets, exceeding the targets associated with that governance model and the successful sourcing engagement. And I think that's probably one last comment that I would make on this slide is, it's important to note that we talked a little bit about SLAs, but it's important to note as a part of governance that our success in these sourcing engagements are based upon our ability to meet the goals of the service levels to bring customer sat, but it's also important to exceed. And I think Tony hit on it a second ago when we talk about, how do you negotiate from a financial perspective into the deal, but how do you negotiate service levels into the deal that allows you to begin to push the levels, your goals, higher and higher on a year-over-year basis to ensure that you're bringing a level of internal customer sat, not only like AT&T wants to bring to the client base from a customer sat perspective, but the CIO delivering to his internal customers, that exceeds and raising the bar every year as a part of that. And I think that's one of the key things, and what I would like to leave you with is exactly that. Our intent is not to just meet your needs and meet your objectives. The intent would be to exceed your objectives, but put an agreement in place that allows for the ability for the partnership and the relationship, to grow based on success in those terms. So, any comments or questions on this slide? Well, excellent. So I guess, again, Frank and Tony, I appreciate the opportunity today from an AT&T perspective to talk to you and the clients on the phone. And as such, I'd like to let everybody know that if there are any additional questions associated with the discussion topics today, obviously I can be contacted here through my email address. But Frank and Tony, again, I just wanted to say thank you from AT&T's perspective for allowing me to talk to your audience today.
And Bob, thank you. This is Frank. Thank you again for a great presentation. Thank you for sharing, your experience. You're doing this for a long time. You're out there. You have a sense of what's happening. A great story to tell, and obviously a great service offering as well. Tony, I appreciate your participation and you sharing your perspective and your experience in the advisory space and other hats you've worn in recent past. Great discussion, gentlemen. Thank you both, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.